Hey guys, tonight we're sinking our sleepy little teeth into something warm, dense, and shockingly historic. You're standing barefoot on the grain-dusted floors of an Egyptian bakery at the break of day about 3,000 years ago. The air is thick with the earthy scent of Emmer wheat and smoke from clay ovens. Your tunic sticks to your back, and someone sneezes flour from the next room over. It's that kind of morning, the kind where the yeast isn't the only thing rising. Your shift hasn't started, but the Nile already glitters like someone spilled gold leaf in the water, and Ra is doing his best to remind everyone that sunstroke is just a missed head-drap away. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and the local time. I love seeing where everyone's listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're watching an apprentice wrestle with a basket of dates that don't want to be mashed. He's already dropped them twice. The head baker, a man with arms like tree trunks, and the patience of a half-baked loaf, grunts from behind a stone grinding platform. He doesn't yell. He never needs to. The ovens, lined with cracked clay, glow gently as the first embers take hold, fed by straw and palm husks. You're just a ghost drifting through the scene, catching snippets of chatter. Someone curses the dryness of this year's grain. Another complains that the yeast smells like feet again. All very standard complaints in a time when bread could either sustain you or break your molars. The bakery is part of a temple complex, because where else would holy carbs be crafted? Bread wasn't just food, it was sacred sustenance. Even the gods needed a snack offering. Apparently, statues of deities get fresh loaves every morning. These loaves, by the way, are shaped like cones, discs, and, curiously, miniature cattle. Some scholars say it's symbolic. Others say it's just ancient bakers flexing their creativity. Historians still argue whether the more eccentric loaf shapes were devotional acts or just excuses to use novelty molds. As you shuffle past the back room, you spot a slab of carved limestone. Someone scribbled a quick offering list. 8 loaves, 2 beer jars, 1 goose, possibly a cucumber. It's not exactly a Michelin menu, but this was ancient luxury. You imagine scribes balancing these deliveries with the same care as a modern-day pastry chef aligning croissants for Instagram. Outdoors, a thin veil of flour drifts through the air like desert snow. Workers lug sacks of Emmer wheat, tough stuff, almost unchewable without soaking or pounding into submission. You trail one to the grinding station. Here, grain is crushed between 2 stones, saddle querns. The top stone is pushed back and forth until the grain surrenders, leaving behind a coarse, grayish flour and a fair bit of stone dust, bonus grit for extra crunch. It's the kind of bread that makes dentists in the afterlife weep. You glance at a mural On the far wall, there's a baker, legs spread, arms elbow deep in a mixing trough. He looks heroic. That was the thing about ancient Egypt. Even dough kneaders got to be immortalized on walls. The guy behind you scoffs. If they'd drawn the flies too, maybe it'd be more accurate. Nearby, someone stirs something in a wide ceramic vat. It bubbles with the unsettling enthusiasm of a swamp. That, your guide whispers, is starter. Technically, it's beer, but in Egypt, beer and bread were siblings born of the same fermentation. One turned into a drink, the other baked into loaves, and both were consumed in terrifying quantities. Children drank beer. Elders drank beer. Cats probably considered it. You lean in closer, and the sour, sweet tang of the brew hits your nose. It's not pleasant, but it's effective. This stuff ferments quickly in the desert heat, and the foam is skimmed off and spooned directly into dough as a natural leavening agent. Modern bakers might frown at this method. Ancient bakers just grin and slap the dough harder. A priest passes by, muttering a prayer as he flicks water toward the ovens. Ritual purification. The flour, the fire, even the brick walls, they were all part of a divine dance. Bread wasn't just food. It was offering, currency, status. You can almost hear the needed devotion in every batch. You wander past a bread mold shaped like a lotus flower. A woman with a face like dry papyrus smacks your hand away before you can touch it. She's been baking here for 3 decades, and she's not impressed by your curiosity. Her loaves are neatly arrayed, tiny, squat things with a dark crust and a chewy middle. For the gods, she mumbles. Not for snacking. You make a mental note not to snack. Then a funny thing happens. A boy walks and holding a clay model of a loaf. Not real bread, just a symbolic one. Turns out, the bakery also makes fake bread. For tombs, you glance at the model again. It's ridiculously detailed, down to the little air cracks on top. Imagine being buried with fake carbs. But that was part of the logic here. In the afterlife, everything had to be represented, including the food. Real bread would rot. Clay bread? That sticks around forever. You crouch near the central oven. It's built like an upside-down pot with the top lopped off. Dough is slapped onto the inner walls. Gravity does the rest. A baker peels away a cooked round with a long stick. It's uneven, a little burnt. He shrugs. Still better than yesterday. Quality control is a vague concept when your timeline includes eternity. Outside, a scribe is taking inventory. He marks down loaves by the dozen, noting their shapes and supposed purposes. 3 for Anubis, 2 for the vizier, 1 pyramid-shaped one for the guy with tooth problems, bread for offerings, bread for healing, bread for the guy who's bad at chewing. Back inside, someone's made a mistake. The dough won't rise. It's flat as a desert lizard. You see a whisper of panic. This isn't just a failed bake. It's a cosmic problem. You learn that some loaves, especially those baked for temple rituals, had to rise properly, or it was a spiritual faux pas. There's muttering about bad omens. One apprentice volunteers to taste it anyway. He survives. Barely. You pause near a window and stare out at the bright Nile. Workers haul bundles of papyrus. Children play with balls made of rolled bread dough. Because why not? The head baker grumbles that they're wasting perfectly good carbs. A woman laughs and hands him a tray of sweetened pastries. Dates mashed with honey, stuffed into a thick dough, and baked to near black perfection. It's the closest thing to dessert they have, and it smells like caramelized dust and dreams. Back near the entrance, a visitor walks in with a request for a special order. She wants 3 loaves shaped like her husband's favorite fish. The bakers don't blink. Artistic carbs are just part of the job. You remember the mural again, the heroic baker. Maybe he wasn't just baking bread. Maybe he was making meaning, bite by sacred bite. A breeze stirs the flour in the air. It settles on your eyelashes, soft as cotton. You feel the weight of time in your lungs. Ancient Egypt didn't build its civilization on gold or conquest alone. It built it on bread. Heavy, chewy, dust-speckled bread. And even now, in this early hour, before the sun has reached its full glare, the ovens keep glowing. Loaves keep rising. And the smell is eternal. The scent of fresh bread follows you into the courtyard like a stubborn cat. You don't shake it. It's better than what's out here anyway. Dust, sweat, and something that might be donkey. You squint at the horizon, where the city of Thebes lazily unrolls itself along the Nile. Mud brick homes perch like sunburnt cakes on the banks, each with its own rooftop oven puffing tiny curls of smoke into the air. You could almost believe every home is secretly a bakery. You make your way through a narrow alley where 2 women slap dough onto griddles over open fires. The bread is thin here, more like modern flatbread than the dense, mold-baked loaves from the temple. This is street bread, quick to make, quicker to eat. One woman sprinkles hers with crushed coriander, the other with honey. You offer your ghostly presents as payment, and no one objects. The dough puffs under the flame like it's exhaling. You chew slowly, mentally, not physically, taking in the crunch, the softness, the slightly fermented tang that lingers at the end. Street bread doesn't pretend to be eternal. It just wants to get you to lunch. A little boy scampers past carrying a round loaf like it's treasure. His sister chases him with a clay jug of beer, both laughing, both barefoot. You follow them to the edge of the marketplace, where merchants holler in a dozen dialects. Someone's selling onions. Someone else offers duck eggs. And yes, there's a baker's stall right in the middle, with bread stacked like little brown pyramids. You notice the loaves here are stamped, literally, with seals, official ones. Stamped bread. That's a thing. In Egypt, bread was often marked to show where it came from. The temple, The palace. The baker down the street with trust issues. You wonder if they had bakery rivalries. Probably. Bakers are territorial, especially when one claims their barley dough rise faster. One merchant waves a loaf at you, a round one, with a bite taken out. He's grinning. Still soft after 2 days, he yells. You pretend to be impressed. He nudges a brick-shaped loaf toward you and whispers, "Don't ask what's in that one. Just soak it first." You drift into a shaded corner where an old man is sketching loaves on a bit of broken pottery. It's not art. It's math. He's recording rations, daily bread counts, beer tallies, grain weights. It hits you. Bread isn't just food here. It's economy. You earn it, trade it, owe it. Taxes, wages, debt payments, everything is measured in loaves. He even has a conversion table. 1 duck equal 5 loaves. 1 good blanket equal 20 loaves. 1 happy marriage equal 400 loaves/year. Probably. Historians still argue whether this bread as currency system was truly stable or just a bureaucratic coping mechanism. Either way, it worked. Sort of. Until someone misplaced a shipment, and the scribe had a meltdown in hieroglyphics. You wander past a scribe's school. Inside, boys with shaved heads and stern expressions copy grain records onto papyrus. Today, 10 sacks of Emmer. Tomorrow, famine. One leans over and doodles a tiny loaf with legs and a face. You wonder if he got in trouble for that. You kind of hope he didn't. Outside the city walls, you follow a trail of donkeys. They carry baskets woven from palm fibers, overflowing with raw grain. It's on its way to another bakery, this one on a royal estate. Not temple, not public. This is palace bread, which means it's unnecessarily elaborate. You approach a mud brick compound that smells faintly of saffron and smugness. Servants rush in and out, and the baker here wears a linen tunic that's actually clean. That's your first clue this is elite baking. The second is the loaf he's working on, twice as tall as usual, stuffed with dates and honey, and shaped like a lotus blossom with little petal ridges. You eavesdrop on a discussion about whether to include figs in the next batch. One assistant votes yes. Another says figs are commoner fruit. A third suggests pomegranate instead. They settle on both, because rich people never choose, they just add more. Nearby, you spot a stack of baking molds, some in animal shapes, others geometric. They're carved from clay, worn smooth by years of use. One mold has tiny falcon wings etched into the base. Another has the cartouche of a pharaoh. Baking here isn't just sustenance. It's theater. Every loaf must impress. A servant carries out a basket of finished bread loaves, and you trail her into the garden. She places them on a low table surrounded by musicians and wine jugs. It's a feast. Not for mortals, at least, not just them. The bread here is for ritual offerings too. but with a distinctly higher carb count. You count at least 12 different varieties. Some have herbs. Some are decorated with tiny seeds. One is shaped like a coiled snake, and they're all glistening under a thin drizzle of syrup. A priest offers a blessing. A cat tries to steal a loaf. Everyone pretends not to notice. You marvel at the fact that cats are sacred. Bread is sacred, and therefore, maybe the cat is just claiming divine carbs. It's spiritual math. You settle under a fig tree. The buzz of insects hums like a slow lullaby, and the heat pulls your eyelids downward. Someone plays a lute nearby, and for a moment you're not sure whether you're dreaming or just full of metaphorical bread. Either way, you're not moving. Eventually, the scene dissolves, and you're elsewhere again. This time, a grain silo. Enormous, circular, sun-baked. A team of men shovels grain from the floor with short wooden paddles. It's a careful process. Grain must be dried, measured, stored, guarded. It's not just food, it's future bread. And bread is everything. You float above the silo and think about all the layers of bread culture you've seen. Sacred loaves for gods, sweet loaves for nobles, stamped loaves for tax collectors, and that weird brick loaf nobody wants to talk about. You wonder what the average Egyptian thought about all this. Probably something like, I just want my ration and a clean jug of beer. As night creeps in, the baking doesn't stop. In some homes, mothers press dough into pans shaped like fish, flowers, even tiny gods. Children poke holes into flatbread with sticks. Some laugh, others cry. A very normal baking experience. One father teaches his son how to check if a loaf is done. He knocks on the crust. Hollow? Good. Sounds like your head? Bake longer. In the far distance, funeral drums echo. A procession moves slowly toward a tomb. Among the grave goods are, you guessed it, loaves. Real ones and fake ones, lovingly packed into jars. Because bread must go where you go, even if it's 6 feet under and metaphysical. You close your eyes, still drifting, still surrounded by flour and faith. And somewhere, in a little bakery on the edge of Thebes, a new batch is rising. The dough stretches, breathes, and cracks just slightly as it touches the heat. The night bakes on. So, you're still wandering through the gentle haze of Egypt's sun-sifted past, toes buried in warm, ancient sand, as the scent of old grains and river reeds trails behind you like a lazy breeze. Now, you duck into the shade of a reed-thatched stall, a rudimentary bakery, if you can call it that, with smoke curling from a clay oven and a rhythm of hands slapping dough that hasn't changed for millennia. This is not your cozy neighborhood boulangerie. There are no croissants, no cheery bakers in aprons with suspiciously clean hands. Just a weary man named something you can't pronounce, hunched over a pile of Emmer flour, methodically kneading the next round of sustenance for scribes, soldiers, and gods alike. His fingers look like they were carved out of riverbed clay and baked for durability. His expression is that of a man who has seen far too much wheat. The Emmer wheat he works with is stubborn. It's not soft like modern flour. It's coarse, hulking, and full of attitude. You try lifting a basket of it, and immediately feel your spine protest. Historians still argue whether Emmer was favored for its hardiness or simply because it was the only thing available that didn't turn into soup when you left it outside for 5 minutes. But either way, it's everywhere. Emmer was the backbone of ancient Egyptian bread, and by extension, Egyptian life. Now, flour in this era isn't ground in some pristine, humming factory. It's made by dragging flat stones across even flatter stones while mumbling ancient expletives. This method predictably grinds in plenty of stone grit along with the flour, which means Egyptian bread has a lovely tooth-ruining crunch to it. Not ideal for midnight snacking, unless your dentist accepts payment in scarab beads. And yes, even that gritty loaf had hieroglyphic street cred. If you were a baker in a temple bakery, your job was almost holy. The gods demanded bread, and lots of it. Some temples produced thousands of loaves a day, not just for offerings, but to feed a small army of priests, workers, and those guys who stood around with ibis masks pretending to be important. Bread wasn't just food. It was currency. It was ritual. It was Instagram-worthy before Instagram existed, which is how it ended up carved into tomb walls with all the reverence of a royal selfie. You step closer to the oven, watching as triangular molds are filled with dough and slid into the belly of a domed clay oven called a tabin. There's no thermostat, no timer, and certainly no non-stick lining. Just heat, intuition, and hope. The baker taps the side of the oven with a stick, not for any particular reason. He just likes the sound it makes. You lean in and catch the scent. Earthy, dense, almost sour. Not a sourdough vibe. More of a this might ferment and bite back kind of sour. Still, there's something deeply comforting about it. Like an old blanket that smells like smoke and safety. Here's the fun part. In wealthier kitchens or temple bakeries, bakers didn't stop at regular loaves. No, sir. They shaped their bread into little cows, birds, even flowers. Edible sculptures. It's unclear if people ate them or just admired them for 3 days until mold took over. Historians still argue whether these were everyday fare or reserved for ceremonial feasts where gods supposedly popped in for dinner and forgot to RSVP. But don't get too cozy. Baking in ancient Egypt came with hazards. For starters, the ovens got scorching hot. You had to know exactly when to stick your arm in without turning it into a papyrus roll. There were also the occasional flour explosions, angry temple supervisors, and that one guy who kept stealing raisins. Still, for all its heat and hazard, bread making was oddly communal. Women, slaves, priests, they all took part. It was part performance, part survival. You reach for a loaf cooling on a reed mat. It's round, dense, and has a bite mark in it, probably left by a ghost of a particularly impatient apprentice. It's not soft. In fact, it's more like edible sandstone. You bite cautiously, and oh yes, there it is. That delightful crunch of powdered rock. You now understand why ancient Egyptians frequently needed dental work before age 30. And just when you think bread can't get weirder, someone offers you a sour-smelling jug of beer. Not the bubbly pub kind. This one is more like chunky, chewy porridge with an attitude. Beer and bread, twins of the Nile. Made from nearly identical ingredients, they formed the dynamic duo of daily life. You could literally live on the two if you had to, and many did. In fact, rations for workers on royal tombs often consisted solely of these two items, plus maybe a dried onion for variety if you were lucky or unusually charming. Now, imagine you're a scribe. You've spent your day hunched over papyrus, writing "The sun god is mighty" for the 100th time. You finally stumble home to your one-room dwelling, exhausted, spiritually crushed, and you're greeted by, yes, a fresh loaf of temple-issued Emmer bread. It's dry, it's hard, it's crumbly, but it's also warm, sacred, and vaguely satisfying. You chew in silence, imagining your molars sanding themselves into submission. The day ends not with dessert, but with a slow gnaw on divinely approved carbs. Meanwhile, some loaves were specifically crafted as offerings. These weren't eaten by humans, but by gods, or at least symbolically. They were stacked in pyramidal formations, carefully decorated, sometimes dyed with exotic colors using fruits or minerals. These loaves weren't meant to nourish, but to impress. Bread that you couldn't eat, but you'd totally want to photograph. Historians still argue whether gods preferred honey-glazed loaves or the ones shaped like ducks. But the symbolism was undeniable. Bread was sacred. In the hush of the temple bakery, you spot a faint mural. It shows a woman baking, hair tied back, laughter forever caught in paint. She holds a paddle in one hand, a loaf in the other, and behind her is a pile of wheat. It's not a dramatic scene. No pharaohs or war chariots. Just a small moment. A moment considered important enough to etch in color on eternal stone. You breathe in the stillness, hearing the faint rustle of palm leaves and the occasional bleat of a goat that seems to have wandered into this memory. You realize something simple, profound, and oddly calming. Bread wasn't just food in ancient Egypt. It was identity, it was ritual. It was a link between the earthly and divine. It crunched, yes, but it also connected. And as you drift out of the bakery and back into the wider, sun-drenched landscape, you carry with you a tiny, flowery truth. Civilization didn't just rise on pyramids or pharaohs. Sometimes it rose on bread, and a baker who dared to carve ducks into dough. The Nile murmurs softly at your side as you wander along its muddy banks. The rhythm of lapping water, oddly synced with the way you're now absent-mindedly chewing the remnants of that Emmer loaf from earlier. Still tough, still crunchy, still somewhere between food and weapon. And yet, it fills you with a sense of connection, not just to the bakers, but to an entire system that ran on flour, fire, and faith. You pause near a cluster of low, whitewashed homes where the smoke rising from clay ovens signals more than just hunger. These are the humble hearths of everyday Egyptian households, bakers without titles, shrines, or temple hierarchies. You step over a shallow threshold and find yourself in someone's kitchen from 3,000 years ago. And just like that, the elite bakeries of Section 3 feel like a 5-star resort compared to what's happening here. Here, bread is made out of necessity, not ceremony. There's no sculpting, no decorative swirls, no gods peering over your shoulder. Just practicality, the mother of invention, and also of underbaked loaves, overcooked crusts, and children who keep stealing dough when they think no one's looking. A girl in a faded linen shift slaps patties of dough onto a hot flat stone near the fire. Her hands are swift, but not graceful. You get the sense she learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, who possibly learned from a goat with strong opinions on fermentation. You sniff the air. The bread smells simpler here, still Emmer-based, still with that mineral crunch, but lacking the bells and whistles of temple loaf artistry. It's round, slightly charred, and flatter than the flatter parts of your personality. And yet it's honest. These loaves tell a story that's older than writing, etched not in hieroglyphs, but in blistered palms and smoky kitchens. In these homes, bread isn't just food. It's survival. It's also community. You notice neighbors trading loaves. One gives a flatbread. The other offers a handful of lentils, or maybe a swig of something fermented. There's no currency, no bartering drama, just quiet understanding. A system of trust baked right into every bite. Historians still argue whether this type of exchange counted as proto-commerce or was more of a neighborly favor economy. But whatever it was, it worked. Now, the flour these women use comes from tiny home grinders, essentially flat stones where grain is painstakingly crushed by hand. You try it, thinking, how hard can it be? And immediately regret it. The process feels like massaging a granite countertop with a rolling pin. After 10 minutes, you've produced about a spoonful of flour and a deep appreciation for your modern blender. It's no wonder dental records from mummified commoners often show teeth worn down to nubs. The bread and grit diet was excellent for bones, just not your own. Still, the variety of breads surprises you. Sure, the Emmer loaf reigns supreme, but there are also honey-sweetened cakes for festivals, flatbreads stuffed with dates, and even little loaves smeared with crushed carob or figs, ancient Egyptian Pop-Tarts if you squint. One particularly round and festive-looking loaf is pulled from the coals, and a woman breaks it open to show the warm center, steaming with spiced paste. It smells faintly of cumin, coriander, and burnt hopes. You take a bite and instantly understand why it earned its place in offerings. Nearby, a boy is playing with leftover dough, squishing it between his fingers and trying to mold it into the shape of a cat. He fails horribly, but keeps trying. That instinct to shape food into little animals? Not a Pinterest invention. Just one more thing Egyptians were doing before it was cool. And while most of this bread is practical and simple, every so often, someone goes overboard. You catch sight of a baking experiment in progress. One woman tries to stack multiple flatbreads with sweet layers in between. It's like an ancient millefeuille if you swap out buttercream for mashed legumes and whatever was lying around. It collapses under its own ambition, but everyone laughs. Even in antiquity, food fails were a shared experience. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about these humble homes is that their bread still mattered beyond the plate. It was part of contracts. Literally, ancient scribes used bread loaves as units of measure and even payment. A day's labor could earn you 5 loaves and 2 jugs of beer. Not a bad haul if you didn't mind being mildly tipsy and perpetually constipated. Wages were distributed in bread, and sometimes disputes were settled in loaves. You took my goat could be solved with a half-dozen flatbreads and a firm handshake. Historians still argue whether this was efficient or just a delicious way to fuel grudge matches. Occasionally, bread even made it into legal documents. You imagine a courtroom drama unfolding, Egyptian style. One party waving a loaf as Exhibit A, while the scribe dutifully records the crust pattern in cursive hieroglyphs. There's something oddly comforting about the idea that legal squabbles were settled with carbs rather than lawsuits. Fewer lawyers, more loaves. Meanwhile, the influence of bread extended beyond the living. Mummies were often buried with loaves tucked beside them, not because the afterlife had a snack bar, but because bread was sustenance for the soul's long journey through the underworld. Picture it. You've just died. Your ka-spirit is trying to get through a labyrinth filled with crocodile-headed gatekeepers. And what do you have to keep you going? One stale loaf of Emmer bread, probably with a side of beer you can't remember packing. Comforting and slightly absurd, like an eternal road trip with bad snacks. As the sky darkens into a dusty mauve and the scent of baking fades into the night air, you realize something. In a world without fridges, blenders, or DoorDash, bread was more than survival. It was cultural glue. It was economic structure, spiritual offering, legal tender, and love language, all rolled into one, occasionally misshapen, sometimes crunchy, loaf. You step back from the doorway of the humble house, brushing flour from your sleeves and crumbs from your chin. The stars are beginning to prick through the Egyptian sky, one by one, like dots on a celestial breadboard. You feel full, not from the bread, though that certainly helped, full of stories, full of warm smoke and ancient patience, full of a soft understanding that what seems boring on the surface, flour water, fire, might actually hold the architecture of an entire civilization. And somewhere in the distance, a donkey brays like it just bit into a loaf too soon. You wake up with flour still in your nose. Or maybe that's just how ancient Egypt smells now. Either way, you're back on your dusty, contented stroll. This time with a slightly better understanding of how everyday folk made their daily loaves without summoning divine thunder or carving dedications into limestone. Still, you can't shake the feeling that bread wasn't just physical fuel. It was something more. So naturally, your dusty sandals lead you toward the part of Egypt where bread turns theatrical, symbolic, and slightly metaphysical. You shuffle toward the temple complexes, the big ones, the ones that make tourists faint and drones crash. Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, places where the gods supposedly hung out, but more importantly, where entire bureaucracies existed solely to keep them fed. And not just with smoke and incense, but with bread. So much bread. You arrive at a temple forecourt, half expecting quiet reverence, but it's buzzing with controlled chaos. This isn't a place of quiet devotion. It's a divine catering operation. Priests in linen bustle between workshops. Scribes hold wax tablets, noting down quantities of grain so obsessively you suspect at least one of them dreams in tally marks. And in the air, ah yes, that familiar warm tang of fermenting dough. Even the gods had to eat, apparently, or at least be offered things that looked like they could. You peek inside the temple bakery. It's enormous, more like a commercial kitchen than a spiritual sanctuary. Ovens the size of chariots radiate heat that makes your eyebrows feel endangered. Workers, some priestly, some not, move with practiced speed. Their job, to produce hundreds of ritual loaves daily, each destined for offering tables, not breakfast plates. These weren't meant to be eaten, at least not by you. What's surprising is the sheer specificity of these ritual breads. There are names and shapes you've never heard of: Ta, Hedge, Bess, and Shenset. Some are molded into animal forms, others into geometrical designs. One loaf you spot is shaped like an ankh. Another, bafflingly, resembles a stylized fish riding a pyramid. It's hard to know if you're at a bakery or an art gallery. Historians still argue whether the variety of shapes symbolized specific deities, festivals, or just gave bored temple bakers something fun to do between sunrise and apocalypse. Then you notice something truly strange. The loaves aren't uniform. Some are studded with herbs. Others have a glossy sheen, possibly from a brush of date syrup, or, more intriguingly, fermented honey beer glaze. A priest gently lifts a tray of these glorified carbohydrates and mutters a prayer, eyes focused, hands steady. You watch, vaguely hypnotized. This isn't just food, it's theater. You can practically hear celestial announcers say, "Next up, Osiris's 3 o'clock snack, now with extra caraway." You learn that each god had preferences: raw, for example, might receive sun-shaped loaves with golden crusts. Hathor could get soft breads scented with sweet herbs. And if you're wondering how anyone knew this, it was written down. Somewhere in a dusty scroll or etched on a temple wall is a sentence that essentially translates to, "Thoth prefers his bread chewy. Thanks." A curious tidbit for later. Some of these loaves were buried in sealed tombs, perfectly preserved for millennia, though modern archaeologists have politely declined to nibble. But here's where things really get funky. Once the loaves were placed on altars, prayers whispered, and incense swirled, they had technically fulfilled their purpose. Divine energy absorbed, cosmic taxes paid, and afterward, the bread didn't just stay there to rot like some moldy relic. Nope, it was taken away and redistributed. You sidle around the back of the temple, where a narrow corridor leads to a small chamber smelling faintly of old yeast and mild disapproval. A group of temple staff sit around, breaking loaves into smaller portions, wrapping some in linen, others in woven palm baskets. It turns out this used bread got passed on to priests, workers, even the poor. The gods may not have chewed, but everyone else sure did. So yes, sacred carbs made a full loop, from human to God, and back to human. A celestial bake share. But not everyone agreed on the process. Some high-ranking temple officials thought eating God-touched bread was a risk, a divine hangover waiting to happen. Others believed the act transferred holiness. Historians still argue. Your brain echoes whether this redistribution was purely practical or partly spiritual. Probably both. Like recycling, but with more incense and slightly more chance of being cursed. Another odd discovery. In temple storerooms, archaeologists have found shelves with fake bread. Not poorly baked bread, literally bread made from mud, clay, or wood, carved and painted to resemble loaves. These weren't for eating or even for gods. They were visual symbols meant to represent offerings when real ones weren't available or necessary. It's like an ancient placeholder image for "loaf goes here." You try to imagine offering your Wi-Fi router a picture of pizza instead of real dinner. And yeah, that tracks. And oh, speaking of representation, don't forget the bread hieroglyph. One of the most common symbols in Egyptian writing is a simple semicircle representing ta, bread. It shows up in words for food, offerings, rituals, and even politics. Bread wasn't just what you ate. It was language, currency, ideology. Imagine if your country's flag featured toast. That's the vibe. You walk through a fresco-covered hall where scribes once painted scenes of bakeries in full swing, workers hauling grain, kneading dough, firing ovens. It's like a step-by-step visual tutorial, just with more gods and fewer pop-up ads. In one corner, you notice a scene showing a giant loaf being carried by two men. It's comically large, like something you'd see in a food challenge. Finish this by sundown and gain Ra's favor, plus a free t-shirt. Outside, the sun hangs low, casting long golden shadows on temple stones. Somewhere behind you, a gong sounds, signaling the evening rites. More bread will be baked, more offerings placed, more crumbs redistributed through channels older than memory. And as the warm breeze carries the smell of baking through the holy colonnades, you sit down by a cool stone wall and realize something beautiful. The gods didn't need to eat, but people needed to give. Bread was devotion shaped by hand, fermented through belief, and offered like a prayer you could bite. You take a moment, tracing your finger over a faint semicircle carved into stone. A loaf. Just a loaf, but one that meant everything. You brush the flour off your tunic again and make your way out of the temple grounds. Behind you, the daily divine snack cycle resets like a cosmic lunch bell. But ahead, the path curves towards something more personal. If bread was holy in temples, it was no less so in the humble spaces where people actually lived. And tonight, you're going from ceremonial altars to sun-baked courtyards and smoky hearths, where the domestic art of baking did more than just feed. It formed the social dough that held ancient Egyptian life together. You pass into a neighborhood of low mud brick homes, clustered like sleeping cats along a dusty lane. The walls are etched with the faint graffiti of time, names, prayers, maybe even a crude doodle of a baker dropping a loaf. You duck through a low doorway into the shade of a narrow house. Inside, it's cool and dim, lit by slits in the wall, and a gentle shaft of light that hits, you guessed it, the baking corner. Every household, rich or poor, had a space for this. The kitchen was more concept than room, and often just a corner, with a stone slab, a clay pot or two, and the ever-present saddle quern. You spot one now, a rectangular stone where someone once ground wheat with a second stone, rhythmically, back and forth, for what felt like half a lifetime. That grinding sound, low and rough, must have been the background music of every ancient neighborhood. Forget Spotify, this was the real home track. Next to the quern lies the baking dome, a simple clay oven, domed like a miniature hut, with a mouth you could barely fit a cat through. And it's still blackened from fire. You crouch near it, your modern knees protesting, and imagine a woman, call her Tia, kneeling just where you are, working flour with water, maybe with a baby strapped to her back, maybe humming an off-key tune that made the dough rise better. That's not historical fact, but let's face it, it's probably true. Now, here's your fact of the day. Most households didn't use wheat. That was a luxury grain. Emmer was the bread and butter grain, pun fully intended. It's tougher, more fibrous, and more demanding. You had to soak it, grind it twice, maybe whisper sweet encouragements before it finally gave in and turned into usable flour. That's why bread took time, and time meant love. And sometimes, teeth. Lots of teeth. Historians have found jawbones from common Egyptians worn down from decades of chewing gritty, sandy bread. That wasn't just flour in there. That was archaeology. But Tia, in your imagination, doesn't complain. She's efficient. She knows the steps. She mixes the Emmer flour with water, lets it ferment slightly, thanks to the wild yeast in the air, and leftover dough stuck to her hands, and shapes it into thick discs. She lays them inside the domed oven, baking directly on hot stones or against the inner wall. A few minutes later, steam puffs out, the smell deepens, and a child, let's call him Min, sticks his head in to ask if it's ready yet. This bread isn't pretty. It's uneven, cracked, a little scorched. But it's warm, and it's life. They'll eat it with lentils or onions, or that fermented fish paste you really don't want to think about too hard. They might smear it with honey, or press it into date syrup, or use it as a utensil to scoop stews. Bread wasn't just food, it was furniture, silverware, sponge, napkin, and dessert. And speaking of versatility, you learn about beer bread. Yes, that was a thing. You've already seen how intertwined bread and beer were, but at home, it was even more clever. Leftover bread was crumbled, soaked, left to ferment, and then strained, boil. Ancient beer. Think of it as recycling, but buzzier. Historians still argue whether this drink had consistent alcohol content or if it just varied wildly, from fizzy wheat soda to knock you down party potion. Either way, kids drank it too. Yep, childhood back then was hydrated and tipsy. You wander further, down a lane where the air smells of baking and firewood. It's late afternoon, and households are prepping the evening meal. You pass a woman with an apron dusted in flour. Modern eyes would call it artisanal. She offers you a round loaf, probably thinking you're some dusty cousin visiting from the Delta. It's dense, slightly cracked, and steaming at the edges. You take a bite and instantly crunch into something that's definitely not flavor. Grit. Good old desert grit. That's your quirky tidbit of the night. Egyptian bread often contained sand. Not on purpose, mind you, but the milling stones, especially the cheap household ones, would shed tiny bits of grit into the flour. That means every loaf had a touch of the landscape, literally. Over time, it wore down enamel, cracked molars, and made dentists in the afterlife very busy. So, if you ever feel modern food is too processed, just remember, ancient bread came with a free exfoliant. Still chewing carefully, you turn into a communal courtyard. Women are gathered around a central fire, chatting as they bake together. Children run in circles, tossing pebbles, one of them clutching half a loaf like it's a prized toy. In moments like this, you realize how bread shaped not just meals, but communities. Baking was noisy, collaborative, and full of gossip. Who added too much salt? Whose husband forgot the barley ration? Who burned their last batch and tried to bribe the gods with it anyway? And here's where it gets quietly magical. Bread became the measure of everything. Workers were paid in loaves. Contracts were sealed over shared bread. Even romantic courtship, yes, that happened, might involve offering someone a sweetened loaf as a gesture, a flirtatious carbohydrate. Imagine a teenage boy carving a tiny fish-shaped loaf and shyly offering it to his crush. For you, he'd say, it's a kind of shaped like the Nile. Hearts flutter, bread flattens. As dusk settles, you climb up onto a flat rooftop where families are gathering for the cool evening air. Below, ovens glow. The smell of charred grain and wood smoke drifts upward. Someone laughs. Someone yells that the bread is done. And in your sleepy haze, you think, how many evenings like this must have passed? Thousands. Tens of thousands. The same dough, the same fire, the same hands, and all of it left behind as crumbs in time. You lie back on warm bricks and look up at the sky, dusting a breadcrumb off your tunic. Above, the stars appear, those same stars ancient Egyptians saw when they bit into their last loaf of the day and sighed, belly full, soul at peace. The bread from Tia's oven still lingers on your tongue as you slip into the cool night. But tonight's journey isn't ending, it's shifting gears. Now, you're leaving behind the comfort of courtyards and climbing into the hierarchy of ancient Egyptian society. Because while every household made bread, not all bread was equal, and some loaves, they were practically power moves in flour form. You follow a camel track winding toward the estate of a nobleman. Let's say he's called Intef. His house looms behind a long mud brick wall, which, like most status symbols, exists mostly to show you that you're outside and he's not. You step through the entranceway, and immediately, everything smells different. There's the same tang of baking, sure, but here it's laced with safflower oil, roasted nuts, and something faintly floral. Someone in this house has access to imported luxuries, and they are absolutely baking them into their carbs. Intef isn't home, of course. He's probably overseeing canal repairs or arguing with a scribe about grain tallies. But his kitchen? Oh, it's very much alive. Several servants bustle between wide counters, and unlike Tia's modest setup, this one boasts actual space, multiple ovens, jars of spices, and a large basin where dough is being kneaded with a rhythmic thump 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 that echoes like a slow heartbeat. And there, on the side table, you spot them fancy loaves. One shaped like a cone, one molded like a fish, one braided like a twist of hair. Some are crusted with sesame, others with dates pressed into the dough like tiny jewels. These aren't just functional bread, they're edible sculpture, culinary performance art, thousands of years before Instagram. Mainstream historians agree that wealthier Egyptians could afford both the time and the ingredients to elevate their bread into something ceremonial. Decorative loaves showed up at parties, funerals, and religious festivals. Think wedding cake vibes, but flatter and more likely to dry out in the sun. Some were even perfumed with herbs. Because why not smell like coriander when being devoured? Still, these beautiful breads weren't just about vanity. In many cases, they were symbolic. A fish-shaped loaf could be an offering to a river deity. A rising spiral might represent the sun god Ra's daily journey. And scholars still argue whether some intricate bread molds, those elaborate patterns carved into clay trays, were purely decorative or had ritual significance tied to the afterlife. Was that wheat spiral just tasty? Or was it your passport to eternity? Of course, luxury had a darker side too. You notice that many hands in this kitchen are calloused. Some belong to servants, others to enslaved workers. Egypt had a deeply stratified society, and the people baking the most beautiful breads were often the ones with the least freedom to taste them. The social loaf had many layers. You move through the kitchen into an open courtyard where baskets of bread are being sorted for delivery. Some will go to temple priests, others to tax officials, a few to the tomb complex across the river, where Intef is already prepping his eternal pantry. Because when you're a noble, even death is a catered affair. And now you take a detour, not in space, but in purpose. Let's talk about funerary bread. Yes, tombs needed bread. In fact, they were stocked with it. Wall carvings often show loaves stacked in neat piles, offered to the deceased, so they'd never go hungry in the afterlife. And in some tombs, archaeologists have actually found the real deal, charred, dried out loaves sealed in ceramic jars, dusty but still identifiable after thousands of years. That's shelf life, even Twinkies envy. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some funerary loaves had additives that modern bakers would never dare touch. One particularly odd specimen included powdered hematite, a type of iron ore. Theories vary. Maybe it was symbolic, maybe medicinal, maybe someone just dropped their eyeliner rock into the dough and called it a day. Historians still argue whether these additives were intentional magic or kitchen accidents elevated by tomb PR. You pause by one of the jars marked for a tomb offering. A servant ties it shut with reed cord. He glances your way and mutters, "Better too much bread than too many curses." It's a joke, but not really. Feeding the dead was a deadly serious business. If you shortchanged a ghost on carbs, you risked more than just a haunted pantry. You invited famine, disease, or the ever-dreaded letter from your priest saying, "We told you so." But hey, what about the living elite? They had their own bread rituals. Think state banquets, where the Pharaoh might be served with flatbreads that spelled out his name in sesame seeds. Or birthday festivals, where entire oxen were wrapped in pastry and baked whole, then served with 10 different kinds of dipping bread. That's not just food. That's a carbohydrate coronation. You step into a shaded portico now, where bread is being painted. Not literally, but almost. Decorators are applying honey glazes, drawing patterns with date paste, even using saffron-infused oils to give loaves a golden sheen. And all this for a feast that will last an afternoon and be forgotten by nightfall. But in that brief window, every bite will scream, "Look how rich I am." Here's your mainstream historical fact. Wealthier Egyptians employed professional bakers, not just for function, but for status. There were entire baker guilds in major cities, teams of specialists who did nothing but knead, shape, ferment, and deliver. The ancient Uber Eats, minus the motorcycles, and with more papyrus. As you stroll through the grand estate, you pass a low shelf where yesterday's loaves have already hardened. They'll be dried and crumbled into animal feed, or maybe, just maybe, used as brick filler. That's another oddity. In a few excavation sites, loaves of bread were found sealed into wall plaster. Scholars aren't sure why. Pest deterrent? Insulation? Weird flex? You decide it was probably a board mason with a snack. Back in the kitchen, the ovens roar. Flames lick the curved roofs. The heat is intense, but the bread rises quickly. You can practically see it breathing, inflating with warmth and yeast. Someone hands you a tiny ceremonial roll, shaped like a lotus. It's soft, sweetened with date syrup, and it melts on your tongue like sugar fog. Not bad for a funeral snack. Night falls again, and the estate quiets. You slip out the back gate and wander toward the river. The Nile flows black and lazy under a sky splattered with stars. You can still taste the honey. You wonder how many other tongues, centuries ago, tasted that same blend of flour and sugar and prayer. Maybe not so different from the loaf Tia made. Maybe more ornate, but equally sacred in its own way. Because whether it came from a palace, a temple, or a soot-darkened home, bread in ancient Egypt wasn't just sustenance. It was identity. It was legacy. It was the line between celebration and starvation, between the living and the dead, between power and hunger. And in every crack of a burnt crust, every grain of sand baked into a bite, you hear their stories. You wake up feeling the faint residue of last night's sweet lotus roll still on your tongue. And with the dawn's soft glow, your feet carry you back to the bustling streets of an ancient Egyptian city. It's market day, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafts through the air, blending with the salty tang of the nearby river and the earthy smell of crushed papyrus. The city is alive with merchants hawking their wares, children darting between stalls, and bakers shouting their specialties, trying to lure customers with promises of the fluffiest, crispiest loaves around. Here, bread isn't just food, it's currency, barter, and social glue. You notice people exchanging small cakes for pottery, workers trading their daily rations for oil and onions, and even scribes scribbling on papyrus scrolls recording bread deliveries and tax payments in kind. It's a society fueled by grain, kneaded and baked into survival. The average worker's bread is simple, often a dense, coarse loaf made from barley or emmer wheat, sometimes mixed with other grains like millet or spelt. These loaves are practical, filling, and affordable, a stark contrast to the delicate, honey-glazed creations of the nobles. The texture is rougher, the flavor earthier, but it gets the job done. After all, you can't expect a laborer to chew on a cake shape like a lotus flower when they're hauling mud bricks all day. One surprising fact: bread was so central to everyday life that some workers were actually paid in it. Their daily wage was a ration of bread, beer, and occasionally onions. Imagine getting your paycheck in loaves, quaint, but probably not so convenient when you need to pay the tax collector or buy clothes. This system made bread not just food, but a kind of living ledger, a way to measure labor and loyalty. Yet bread's importance extended beyond mere sustenance. It was deeply embedded in the social and religious fabric of the city. Temples received daily bread offerings to nourish the gods, and festivals often featured public bread sharing, reinforcing community bonds. It was common for people to leave bread at shrines as a gift to deities or the spirits of the dead, a practice that shows how intertwined bread was with faith and the unseen world. Here's a quirky tidbit that might surprise you. Some bakers used yeast captured from the wild, including natural yeasts found on fruit skins or even from the Nile's reeds. These wild yeasts gave bread a unique flavor profile, and the methods for cultivating them were jealously guarded secrets. In fact, some archaeologists think that certain sourdough strains from ancient Egypt might have survived to this day, hidden in traditional baking practices. Historians still argue whether these wild yeast cultures were deliberately cultivated or discovered by accident, but either way, they contributed to the distinctive tang and texture of Egyptian bread, setting it apart from other ancient breads. Back in the city, you observe how bread also played a role in social signaling. Certain types of bread were associated with specific classes or professions. For example, the wealthier citizens might enjoy bread made from finely sifted wheat flour, while commoners ate coarser barley bread. Priests often consumed bread baked with special herbs believed to have purifying properties, and festival breads sometimes contained colorful spices or nuts, elevating the humble loaf to a celebratory treat. One bustling bakery near the market catches your eye. The baker, an older man with flour-dusted robes, kneads dough with expert hands, humming a tune that sounds like a lullaby for dough. Around him, apprentices shape loaves of all sizes, some plain, some intricately patterned with braided edges or stamped with hieroglyphic seals. These seals indicated the bakery's origin, or the baker's signature, a form of ancient branding. You notice a crowd gathering around a woman who's demonstrating a peculiar bread making technique involving a special wooden paddle. She deftly flips flatbreads onto a domed clay oven's surface, producing thin, crisp rounds that puff up in the heat. These are different from the typical loaves, more like early pita or crackers, perfect for dipping or stacking with fillings. As you watch, a debate arises among the onlookers about whether these flatbreads originated from Egypt's southern neighbors or developed independently. Scholars today still argue the precise origins and cross-cultural influences of these ancient breads, with some evidence pointing to trade routes that brought new grains and techniques into the Nile Valley. In the background, you hear the rhythmic thump of grinding stones. Flour production was a labor-intensive process, often done by women who sat hunched over querns, turning the heavy upper stone to crush grain against the lower one. It was dusty, noisy work, and the flour quality varied greatly. Some flours were fine and white, prized by the elite, while others were coarse and gritty. One amusing ancient recipe found in papyrus scrolls calls for mixing bread dough with beer leftovers, creating a slightly fermented batter that would rise better and have a tangy flavor. Bakers probably didn't get a choice in the matter. Waste not, want not. But we like to imagine some ancient Egyptian hipster bakers pioneering sourdough before it was cool. As you stroll through the busy streets, you see the evidence of bread's role in law and order. Bakers had guilds and rules, and theft of bread was considered a serious crime, sometimes punishable by fines or even whipping. Given how vital bread was, stealing a loaf wasn't just petty theft. It was a threat to the community's survival. You pass a town notice board, a wooden slab covered in papyrus notices. One announcement warns against selling counterfeit bread, that is, bread made with fillers like sand or clay to increase weight but reduce nutrition. Unscrupulous bakers occasionally tried this scam, and consumers were rightfully outraged. Trust in bread meant trust in the baker, and breaking that trust was risky business. To close this bustling chapter, you pause by a quiet shrine where a small loaf sits, wrapped in linen. It's an offering to Bes, the god of household protection and fertility, often invoked by women and bakers alike. The humble bread offering here is a reminder. Behind every loaf, there's a prayer for health, prosperity, and a full stomach. And as the sun sets on the marketplace, you realize that in ancient Egypt, bread was much more than food. It was culture, economy, faith, and survival all baked together. The aroma of fresh bread still lingers as you follow a narrow alley toward a quieter part of town where the royal palace looms, its sandstone walls glowing softly in the afternoon sun. Here, bread takes on an even more elaborate role, far beyond simple sustenance. It becomes an art form, a symbol of power, and, surprisingly, a diplomatic tool. Inside the palace kitchens, dozens of bakers work under the watchful eye of the head baker, whose job is as prestigious as any court official's. These bakers craft delicate loaves shaped like lotus flowers, animals, or even miniature pyramids. Each design carries meaning. The lotus symbolized rebirth and purity. The falcon represented the god Horus and royal protection, while pyramid-shaped breads hinted at eternity. You lean in to watch as an apprentice carefully paints edible decorations onto a loaf using crushed beet juice and honey. The colors glisten under the torchlight, creating a bread that is as visually stunning as it is delicious. These breads were meant for special occasions, offerings at religious ceremonies, banquets celebrating the Pharaoh's triumphs, or gifts presented to foreign dignitaries. Speaking of gifts, it might surprise you that bread was sometimes included in diplomatic exchanges. When envoys from distant lands arrived, they were often presented with elaborate bread baskets as symbols of goodwill and hospitality. Imagine a Mongol ambassador receiving a basket of delicately crafted Egyptian bread and being so confused by its beauty and complexity that they questioned whether it was food or art. Historians still debate just how widespread this practice was, with some evidence suggesting it was reserved for elite circles, while other sources hint at more common use. What's certain is that bread, in these contexts, transcended its everyday role and became a vehicle for cultural expression and political messaging. Inside these palace kitchens, you overhear a lively argument between bakers about the best leavening techniques. Some insist on using wild yeast strains nurtured from the air and old dough starters, while others champion using beer foam as a rising agent. The debate has no clear winner, but the passion shows how seriously bread was taken, even here. A fascinating fringe fact: there's a legend among the palace bakers about a bread that never stales, a recipe passed down through generations, but kept secret. Some claim it involved baking bread in a sealed clay vessel with fragrant herbs, preserving it for weeks or even months. Modern scientists have tried to replicate this without much success, but the legend endures as a testament to ancient Egyptian culinary ingenuity. The royal bread also reflects social hierarchy. Some loaves contained precious ingredients like dates, figs, or sesame seeds, luxuries unavailable to the common folk. These enriched breads were not just treats, but status markers, flaunting wealth and divine favor. As you walk past the palace gardens, the fragrance of thyme and coriander mingles with the faint scent of baking bread, reminding you how closely cooking and nature were linked in ancient Egypt. The use of aromatic herbs in bread wasn't merely for flavor, but also believed to carry protective and healing properties. You pause to consider the role of women in bread making. While most baking was a household chore, royal and temple bakeries employed skilled female bakers known as bread priestesses. These women oversaw the production of sacred bread used in rituals and ceremonies, and their expertise was highly respected. Interestingly, some tomb paintings depict women offering bread to the gods, highlighting the spiritual significance tied to female bakers. Historians still argue whether these women held formal religious titles or if their roles were more informal, but nonetheless crucial. Behind the scenes, baking bread for the palace was a logistical marvel. Grain supplies had to be carefully managed, ovens heated to precise temperatures, and hundreds of loaves produced daily without modern tools. You imagine the chaos and coordination, akin to a well-oiled machine, or perhaps a frantic kitchen during holiday season. Before you leave the palace district, you spot an ancient scribal record listing daily bread rations for the royal family and court officials. The quantities are staggering, dozens of loaves per person each day, reflecting both appetite and the centrality of bread to life at the top. You wonder if the Pharaoh himself ever pondered the humble loaf's power, how something so simple could unify a kingdom, sustain an army, and impress even the most formidable foreign rulers. Outside, the city hums on, the scent of baking bread now mingling with evening incense. You carry with you the taste of royal breads, delicate, sweet, and rich, and a growing appreciation for the unexpected roles bread played in ancient Egypt's grand story. You step away from the palace and into the bustling market streets, where the everyday baker's world unfolds with an entirely different rhythm. Here, bread isn't a symbol of royalty or religion, but the very lifeblood of the common people. You feel the warmth radiating from open ovens, smell the yeasty aroma mixing with the fresh fruits and spices stacked on stalls nearby. The city's heartbeat seems to pulse in rhythm with the clatter of wooden paddles sliding loaves into and out of the ovens. Street bakers are the masters of efficiency and innovation. Unlike the palace's elaborate, slow-baked treats, these loaves need to be fast, filling, and affordable, fuel for farmers, laborers, and traders who rely on bread for every meal. The bread here is coarser, denser, and less adorned, but no less essential. As you watch a baker toss handfuls of flour and water onto a wooden board, kneading vigorously, you notice the variety of shapes: round, flat, and even some twisted into rings. Each shape corresponds to different uses and prices, a bit like how you might pick between a sandwich, a roll, or a bagel today. A curious thing: some loaves are pierced with small holes or slits, not just for looks, but to allow steam to escape during baking. A simple technique that's surprisingly effective at preventing sogginess. Historians still argue whether commoners had access to leavened bread, or if most consumed unleavened versions. Some evidence suggests that yeast was scarce and costly. So many breads were dense flatbreads, similar to modern pita or tortillas. Others believe that by the New Kingdom, leavened breads were more widespread, thanks to better grain processing and yeast cultivation. A quirky detail you overhear from a vendor is about beer bread, a type of loaf made with leftover brewery foam that acted as a natural rising agent. This resourcefulness showcases the deep connection between Egypt's famous beer culture and bread-making traditions. In fact, it's said that ancient Egyptian bakers and brewers worked hand in hand, sometimes literally, sharing ingredients and techniques to perfect their crafts. You observe children darting around the bakery stalls, sometimes sneaking tiny bits of fresh bread as their reward for running errands. For many families, bread was more than food. It was a form of currency, barter, and social glue. Bakers often extended credit to customers or exchanged bread for goods like pottery or cloth. A particularly fun and somewhat messy practice you notice is how some bakers used animal dung, not the most glamorous ingredient, but crucial for firing ovens. The dung burned hot and steady, making it an indispensable fuel source in a land with scarce wood. It's one of those details that might make you pause your bedtime snack and reconsider what counts as a natural cooking method. Women played a pivotal role in these local baking scenes too. Most household bread was prepared by women who passed down recipes and techniques through generations. This wasn't just a chore, but a communal ritual, with women gathering to grind grain, knead dough, and share stories, much like a social club, but with flour dust instead of coffee stains. Interestingly, some archaeologists found clay tokens near bakeries that might have been early coupons or receipts, hinting at organized sales and economic systems far earlier than you'd guess. This fuels ongoing debates about how sophisticated ancient Egyptian marketplaces really were, and whether bread was as commercialized as any modern bakery. You pause by a potter's stall, admiring the simple yet elegant clay bread molds used to shape loaves. Some molds bear inscriptions or images, an early form of branding, or maybe just the baker's signature touch. There's even evidence of bakeries advertising their goods by decorating the molds with symbols of gods, hoping to bless their bread with divine favor and attract customers. As the sun dips low, the market's frenzy slows, and you realize that behind every loaf, from the palace delicacies to the street corner staples, there's a rich tapestry of culture, economy, and everyday life. Bread in ancient Egypt wasn't just something you ate. It was how people lived, worked, worshipped, and connected. You finish your visit with a warm flatbread, still fresh from the oven, simple, hearty, and grounding. The taste is humble, but somehow profound. A reminder that even the most ordinary things can carry stories thousands of years old. You follow the trail of breadcrumbs, quite literally, back to the sacred spaces where bread wasn't just fuel, but a spiritual offering, a medium connecting the earthly with the divine. Temples dedicated to gods like Osiris and Hathor held elaborate baking rituals where priests prepared bread to be presented on altars, believed to sustain the gods and maintain cosmic order. The smell of incense mingled with warm bread would have filled these hallowed halls, creating an atmosphere thick with reverence and subtle yeast. Priests, who were often skilled bakers themselves, took their roles seriously. Bread for the gods had to be flawless, perfectly shaped, pure in ingredients, and often inscribed with prayers or symbols. Sometimes these breads were crafted in the shapes of animals, plants, or hieroglyphs, turning bread into edible art. The idea of food as symbolic object is a fascinating concept that makes you rethink your last half-hearted attempt at fancy toast. Historians still argue whether these sacred breads were ever consumed by humans or solely left as offerings. Some evidence points to offerings being ceremonially burned, while others suggest that priests or temple workers might have eaten the blessed loaves, believing in their spiritual potency. In one quirky twist, some temple breads were made with blue lotus petals, a flower known for its mild psychoactive properties, possibly intended to enhance the spiritual experience of rituals. You might call that the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a holy snack, though it probably wasn't your average midnight craving. The production of temple bread was a communal affair, involving not just priests, but temple workers, and sometimes entire villages. This collective baking served to reinforce social bonds and hierarchical order within the temple economy. Bakers had to follow strict rules about cleanliness and ritual purity, washing hands and using special ovens reserved for these sacred loaves. Interestingly, these ovens differed from the common street kilns. They were often built underground or within temple walls, designed to contain sacred fire that symbolized divine presence. Some archaeologists speculate these temple ovens had magical significance, with flames considered a form of communication with the gods. Bread inscriptions from temple contexts often contained messages about prosperity, protection, or agricultural fertility, demonstrating how intertwined bread was with the cycles of life and death. These inscriptions are sometimes the only surviving records of prayers, reminding you how essential bread was beyond simple nourishment. You learn that bread was also a form of divine currency in temple economies. Priests and temple workers received bread rations as part of their livelihood, blurring the lines between sustenance, payment, and spiritual blessing. This arrangement shows how bread was woven tightly into the fabric of ancient Egyptian society, far beyond what modern snacks can claim. You end this section reflecting on the powerful symbolism of bread, realizing it was much more than a daily staple. It was a medium through which people expressed faith, hierarchy, and community, all baked into a humble loaf. You trudge alongside the dusty Nile riverbanks, where ancient Egyptian bakers sourced their essential ingredients, weaving together the natural environment with their daily bread-making rituals. The staple grain was Emmer wheat, hardy and well-suited to the floodplain's shifting conditions. You can almost feel the coarse texture of the grain between your fingers, imagining the repetitive pounding and winnowing that turned it into flour. This process was laborious and vital, a tactile reminder of how connected Egyptians were to their land and its cycles. Interestingly, the grain's quality varied depending on the season and flood's generosity. When the Nile overflooded generously, the silt deposited was richer, producing better grain yields and, consequently, tastier bread. In drier years, grain scarcity made bread less fluffy and more precious, probably not the kind of snack you'd risk dropping on the floor. The Egyptians' dependence on the Nile's caprices meant that their bread was a direct reflection of environmental rhythms, turning every loaf into a small, tangible season's report. Historians still argue whether the grain used in common breads was always the same as that reserved for temple bread. Some suggest that temple breads used only the finest, whitest flour, while everyday bread might contain coarser mixes, sometimes even including barley or other grains. This difference in grain quality reflected the social stratification of ancient Egypt, where not everyone got the same slice of life or bread. You might chuckle at the idea that even in 3000 BCE, people worried about gluten quality, though they had no idea what gluten was. The rise and fall of bread quality must have been a constant source of kitchen drama, like a prehistoric version of Who Ate the Last Slice? Water, another crucial ingredient, was drawn from the Nile, often muddied and teeming with life. The Egyptians were surprisingly pragmatic about this, boiling or letting the water settle before using it for dough. In some rare cases, they mixed dough with milk or honey, adding a sweet twist, making you wonder if they invented the first honey-glazed donut, just centuries ahead of Starbucks. Salt was added not only for flavor, but as a preservative, essential in the hot Egyptian climate, where bread could spoil quickly. But too much salt could ruin the dough's rise, so bakers had to carefully balance this tricky ingredient, kind of like today's kitchen experimenters, with low-sodium recipes and keto-friendly bread. You also discover an intriguing fringe theory that some bakers added small amounts of fermented dough from previous batches, much like sourdough starters today. This would mean ancient Egyptians enjoyed naturally leavened bread with subtle, tangy flavors, a far cry from the flat, unleavened bread you might expect. This also hints at a sophisticated understanding of natural fermentation long before modern microbiology. You wander into discussions about how the seasonal and environmental factors affected baking practices. Were bakers seasonal artisans, or did they bake daily? Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptian baking was a year-round profession or more intermittent, influenced heavily by agricultural cycles and religious festivals. In any case, you appreciate the delicate balance these bakers maintained between nature's gifts and human craft, creating bread that was not only sustenance, but a mirror of the land itself. You step into a bustling, ancient Egyptian bakery, a place alive with the warmth of ovens and the faint smell of charred grain. The bakers here were masters of their craft, wielding not only flour and water, but also a host of tools that seemed surprisingly familiar. Imagine wooden paddles, clay ovens, and sieves, tools that would look at home in a rustic modern bakery, albeit with a bit more Nile silt sprinkled around. One fascinating fact is that most ancient Egyptian bread was baked on flat stones heated by fire beneath them, similar to a griddle. This technique created a variety of bread textures, from thin, crisp flatbreads to thicker loaves with a chewy crumb. You can almost hear the sizzle as dough hits the hot stone, that intimate hiss of moisture meeting heat, a sound that must have been a comforting soundtrack in the early morning kitchens. You might find it odd, but the ovens themselves were often simple clay structures, shaped like beehives or domes. They were fueled with straw and wood, which burned quickly, requiring bakers to be quick and skilled at maintaining the right temperature. Unlike today's thermostats, these bakers relied on intuition, experience, and maybe a lucky guess or two. Historians still argue whether all ancient Egyptian bakers were professionals, or if many households baked their own bread at home. Archaeological evidence points to both scenarios: large-scale bakery workshops that served communities, alongside small home ovens, suggesting a hybrid system of bread production. A quirky tidbit to chew on: some ovens were decorated with magical symbols or protective inscriptions to ward off evil spirits, because apparently even bread wasn't safe from supernatural sabotage in ancient Egypt. The idea that you might bless your bread before baking it adds a mystical flavor to the otherwise mundane task of cooking. You also find that the kneading process was a social affair, often performed by women who sang or chanted as they worked, turning bread making into a communal ritual. This connects to broader Egyptian cultural practices, where daily work was often infused with music and ceremony. A far cry from the silent, caffeine-fueled mornings many of us endure. Interestingly, some loaves were shaped into symbolic forms: animals, gods, or hieroglyphs, making bread not only edible, but also an artistic and religious statement. Imagine biting into a loaf shaped like a scarab beetle or a falcon, combining nourishment with devotion. You realize that the baker's world was as much about sensory experience, smell, sound, touch, as it was about survival. Each loaf was a small masterpiece, crafted under challenging conditions, but rich with cultural significance. You drift deeper into the ancient Egyptian bakery scene, where the importance of bread extends far beyond the kitchen or the dinner table. Bread was a currency, a form of payment, and even a religious offering. Picture a world where the staff at the temple or the builders of the pyramids weren't paid in coins, but in daily rations of bread and beer. This staple was literally the backbone of the economy. One standout fact: bread was so essential that scribes kept detailed records of grain storage, milling, and distribution, inscribing these accounts on papyrus scrolls that have survived millennia. The bureaucracy behind bread production was immense, reminding you that even in the ancient world, supply chains could be as complicated as today's online grocery deliveries, minus the drones, of course. A quirky tidbit for your wandering mind: some breads included unusual additives like dates, figs, or even spices such as cumin and coriander. The variety wasn't just about flavor. Some ingredients were believed to have health benefits or magical properties. For instance, a pinch of anise might have been tossed in to ward off indigestion or improve dreams. So maybe bread was the original ancient Egyptian sleep aid, before fans and soft background hums. Historians still argue whether the elite's access to the finest bread differed drastically from common folk, or if there was more shared enjoyment of these baked goods across classes. Archaeological findings hint at social stratification in grain quality and bread shape, but also at surprising overlaps in taste and consumption habits. You consider the communal nature of bread, imagining marketplace stalls filled with shouting vendors hawking their fresh loaves, while buyers selected their preferred shapes and flavors. Bread was not just food, it was social glue, binding people together in daily rituals. Moreover, bread found its way into religious ceremonies. Offerings of bread and beer were presented to gods to ensure fertility, good harvests, and protection. You can almost hear the murmurs of priests reciting prayers over loaves shaped like sacred animals or hieroglyphs, transforming each slice into a spiritual act. Your mind lingers on how something as simple as bread carries such weight, connecting food, economy, religion, and culture, a multi-layered story baked right into the crust. As you step closer to the end of your journey through ancient Egyptian baking, you find yourself tracing the final impressions left by these ancient bakers, the artisans who mastered a craft that was as vital to their world as air or water. Bread, for them, wasn't just nourishment. It was a symbol of life itself, a daily ritual that intertwined the sacred and the mundane. You picture the bustling bakery again, ovens glowing with soft amber light, the scent of baking grain filling the air, hands skillfully shaping dough into familiar and mysterious forms. Remember those delicate bread animals you've come across? Those shapes weren't merely decorative. They told stories, carried prayers, and connected the living with the divine. Here's an unexpected quirk. Some scholars suggest that ancient bakers might have had secret recipes or trade secrets handed down orally, almost like mystical formulas. Imagine a baker guarding their special blend of grains or fermentation methods, like a modern chef protecting a secret sauce. Historians still argue whether these secrets were widespread or confined to elite workshops, but the possibility adds a hint of mystery to the story. Your thoughts drift to the writing on walls, the actual inscriptions showing bread recipes, bakery layouts, and grain transactions, etched for posterity and practical use alike. This ancient record-keeping reveals a civilization deeply organized around bread, where even the humblest loaf had a story worth telling. Now, as you settle into the quiet of the night, you sense the connection between those ancient bakers and yourself. Their dedication, their artistry, and their very human routines echo across thousands of years, a reminder that the simplest things often hold the deepest meaning. Slowly, your mind eases like warm dough settling in a rising oven. The warmth, the scent, the gentle hum of the past blend softly with your present. The night stretches out comfortably ahead, quiet and full of promise. Breathe in the calm, feel the softness of the moment, and know that you carry a piece of that ancient world with you, tucked gently in the folds of your thoughts, like a loaf wrapped in linen, waiting patiently to be savored. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.